Tonight at 10, after 20 months of conflict, Yemen is at breaking point with thousands facing starvation. We have one of the first reports from the rebel stronghold of Sada, a city destroyed in recent fighting.
Hundreds of people used to make a living here, selling sweets, food, clothes, and now it's completely destroyed. They fled, leaving everything behind.
The United Nations has warned that the number of acutely malnourished children in the country has risen to almost 2.2 million. And an appeal is to be launched by a group of British charities for civilians facing hunger in Yemen. Also tonight, care providers say the system in England is at breaking point and an urgent injection of money is needed.
It is short-term tinkering with a system which is fundamentally broken. The system needs to be reviewed and properly considered rather than just knee-jerk reactions.
In Syria, Assad supporters celebrate as government forces claim they've retaken the entire city of Aleppo. Hundreds of thousands of Southern Rail customers have been advised not to use its services tomorrow because of the latest strike.
Hello. Frost is going to be widespread over the weekend.
And Ian McCaskill, for many years one of the BBC's most familiar faces, has died.
In the south, more on what our train users can expect in the days to come after a failed legal attempt to stop the latest strike. And staff at this and other Dorset care homes are told sign new contracts or lose your job.
Good evening. After 20 months of conflict, Yemen is at breaking point, according to the Disasters Emergency Committee, which is launching an appeal to help many thousands of civilians facing hunger and starvation. 10,000 lives have already been lost, with people caught between the armed coalition, led by the Saudis, and the rebels, led by the Houthi militia. UNICEF estimates that some 2.2 million children are acutely malnourished and they need urgent care. The rebel stronghold is in the northern city of Sada, where some of the worst fighting has been taking place. BBC Arabic's Nawal Al-Makafi is one of the first journalists to enter that city, and this is what she found.
Seeing firsthand a testament of what one city has endured. This is where the conflict has been at its fiercest. Before the war, 50,000 people lived here. In the last 18 months, Sada has become a key battleground, the heart of the Houthi rebellion and the target of more airstrikes than any other Yemeni city. This was once Sada's busiest market. Hundreds of people used to make a living here, selling sweets, food, clothes, and now it's completely destroyed. They fled, leaving everything behind. We visit the nearby school. It's been damaged by an airstrike. The headmaster tells me he's afraid it'll happen again. Next door is something the Saudis would consider a target, a Houthi arms depot. He's repeatedly begged them to move it, but even if the school moves, the weapons will follow. With no hope of the conflict ending soon, and despite the dangers, the children have returned to their classes. They tell me their stories, the things they've seen in this war. Saleh was in his bedroom. He says he heard the fighter jets above. Moments later, the strike hit his home. We were lucky. My family escaped, he says. But we lost everything. I miss my bicycle most. These stories are all too familiar. Mohammed also lost his home. Along with his uncle, he takes me to see what's left of where he grew up.
We were born here. We lived here. Look at these houses. They tell their own story.
6 months after losing their home, Mohammed then lost his father. We obtained footage of the attack from a local journalist. As an ambulance driver, Mohammed's father rushed to the scene of this airstrike. As he dragged the wounded from the rubble, another airstrike hit. A so-called double tap. The boy's father and 17 other people were instantly killed. The UN have condemned the use of these double-tap airstrikes in Yemen and said the targeting of rescue workers amounts to a war crime. The Houthis are not blameless. The UN accuses them of using civilians for cover. They've also been launching missiles from Sada into Saudi Arabia. In May 2015, the Saudi-led coalition declared Sada a military zone. This violated the laws of war, which prohibit the grouping of a number of military targets as one. It also meant that they no longer distinguished between combatants and civilians. According to the United Nations, the first wave of airstrikes destroyed 1,200 structures. Amongst them, 5 markets, a petrol station, and 27 members of one family were killed in their home. Half the city have now fled their homes in search of safety. The women show me even here they've been targeted. But with airports closed and borders blocked, they have nowhere else to go. They've lost everything, even their hope for the future. Nawal Al-Makhafi, BBC News, Sada.
And you can see more of Nawal's reporting from Yemen in the Our World documentary. It's called The Funeral Bombing. It'll be on this Saturday and Sunday on the BBC News channel at 9:30 p.m. and on the BBC iPlayer too. Now, the social care system for elderly and disabled people in England is at breaking point, according to providers, and an urgent injection of money is needed. Changes are expected to be announced by ministers later this week, and they're believed to be considering approving a temporary rise in council taxes. They're also considering calls to set up a cross-party commission, as our political editor Laura Kunsberg tells us.
She's in no hurry to reveal how the government plans to cope with care. But Number 10 cannot escape from the urgency. The pressures of how we pay as a country to look after our old. Hello. There was no mention of social care in the mini budget just weeks ago. But on Thursday, ministers will announce that councils can raise extra cash.
Minister David Mowat.
The spending on long-term care in our country is more than the OECD average. In particular, it is more than comparable economies such as France and Germany. Nevertheless, I accept, Mr. Speaker, that our system is under strain.
Councils in England are already able to charge an extra 2% on council tax for care. Ministers will allow them to charge a little more, increasing the precept, as it's known. But of course, council tax is based on property values. And with more and more demands for care and smaller overall council budgets, the formula is tight, to say the least.
The concern that we would have in the Local Government Association is that we create a postcode lottery in your area on whether you're actually in an area that does raise it or has the ability to raise a reasonably good amount.
With shortages in social care putting historic pressure on hospitals, David Cameron, when Prime Minister, was hunting for a long-term solution.
This is an issue that has been ducked by all political parties, really, because the consequences are awful, but the means of solving it are difficult. And it's why I've called for the government to lead an approach, bringing all parties together, setting up a cross-party commission.
David Cameron's team was interested in the idea.
They were. We went in and talked to them. We presented them with a paper, and then the whole run-up to the referendum took over, and we never got any response from that. And then, of course, there's been a change of government.
So you know that David Cameron's team was considering this. What would you say to Theresa May's team?
Engage, talk to us now. There is an urgency about this.
Behind closed doors, plenty of politicians worry the current system can't last without some major changes. But it's almost been sacrilege for anyone in the government to say that in public. That's why there is some sympathy among ministers for the idea of a commission, to take the politics out of it and allow them to concentrate on making big decisions. But that's not the only option that ministers will consider, and none of them is straightforward.
The government can make choices about the money it spends. So far, it's chosen to ignore some of the most elderly and some of the most vulnerable people in society. It's quite disgraceful, but this week is an opportunity for the government to change tack on that and give social care the funding it needs.
On Thursday, ministers will explain how councils in England will be able to raise a little more to spend a little more. But a permanent solution for how we care for our elderly with dignity, that's a long way off. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as Laura was suggesting there seems to be a growing consensus at Westminster among all parties that the social care system in England needs far-reaching reform. The number of people over the age of 65 has risen by 1 million since 2010. Social care includes looking after people in residential and nursing homes and providing help for those who are at home. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports from a care home in London.
76, 7 and 3.
Bingo today at a residential home. One example of social care.
Number 48, 48.
It's a vital public service, but unlike the NHS, much of it is funded by local authorities with money from council tax and central government. And that also includes care in the home. But with demand for these services increasing as funding is cut, there are warnings the system is at a tipping point.
Local authorities who buy the majority of care are having smaller and smaller budgets to cope with increasing demand. It's a real recipe for a nightmare.
English local authorities have cut spending on care for older people by 9% over 5 years from 2009. This has meant 400,000 fewer pensioners getting funding for care. There are predictions of a £2.3 billion gap between projected demand for services and the money currently planned by 2020. Funding cuts have meant that local authorities have tended to reduce the fees they pay care providers on behalf of those who qualify for support. Some have pulled out of the market. This one is financially secure, though it says an increasing proportion of its residents are paying for their own care. Here they believe that higher council tax increases for social care would help ease the pressure, but it would just be a start in dealing with the underlying problems.
It is short-term tinkering with a system which is fundamentally broken. The system needs to be reviewed and properly considered rather than just knee-jerk reactions which won't really make any ongoing difference to a very precarious sector.
Social care cuts are now a huge problem for the NHS. Elderly patients can be stuck in hospital because continuing care can't be arranged at home or in their local communities.
Underfunding social care is inefficient. It's a false economy, because if people don't get the essential care and support they need, they will end up in more expensive parts of the system, like hospitals. It will impose a big human cost on families and carers.
What's happening in England isn't the same as in Scotland and Wales, where cuts in adult social care have not been so deep. They integrated the NHS and social care some years ago in Northern Ireland. Recently, Scotland has followed that example. But all across the UK, the pressures are the same: an ageing population with increasingly complex care needs. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Just following on from what Hugh was saying there, if you want to find out more about care, how much it costs, especially where you live, BBC has produced a care guide. If you go to bbc.co.uk/care, you can go in there and put your details in and find out what's happening in your area. Well, Britain may well need a transitional deal before it finally leaves the European Union, according to the Chancellor Philip Hammond. He told MPs there was an emerging view that it might take longer than the 2-year timetable to finalise Britain's future relationship with the EU. He said that thoughtful politicians and officials on both sides could see the benefits of a transitional approach. So let's ask what that means with our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed. Does it mean that Brexit's going to take longer than expected, Kamal?
Could well do, Hugh. I think that we haven't had a huge amount of clarity about too much to do with Brexit, and certainly not particularly on the timetable. All we do know is what's called the Article 50 process. Now, this is the process that is triggered by the British government. We decide when we start that process, but then there's a very strict timetable. It takes 2 years then, legally, to extricate ourselves from the European Union. Now, the argument that Mr. Hammond was putting forward today, that, as you say, rather archly, he said would be agreed with by thoughtful politicians, was that you're not simply going to have an off switch, an on-off switch at the end of that 2-year process. Suddenly we'll be out of the EU, and all those thousands of rules that govern our relationship with the European Union, built up over 40 years, will suddenly just end and be replaced by a whole new set of rules. He is saying there'll need to be a transitional period after that to allow a tapering of the rules to do with our relationship with the EU and a building of the new set of rules, new trade agreements, not only with the EU, but with the rest of the world. What's interesting, of course, if that 2-year process takes longer, the next general election, 2020, I imagine that by then, Philip Hammond is already preparing the ground. Those people who thought that by 2020 we'll be out, we'll be finished with the European Union, I think are going to be possibly somewhat disappointed.
OK, Kamal, again, thanks very much. Kamal Ahmed there with the latest for us. And let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now then. Counter-terrorism police have arrested 6 people after a series of raids in Derby, Burton-on-Trent and London. 5 men and a woman are suspected of planning an act of terrorism. An army bomb disposal team was called to a house in Normanton, in that area of Derby, as a precaution, and sources say the arrests are significant. Post office workers are to strike over 5 days next week in a dispute over jobs, pensions and branch closures. The action will include Christmas Eve, according to the Communication Workers Union. But the Post Office says it'll be business as usual across nearly all of its network. It says only around 3% of branches will be affected. A man who strangled a Metropolitan Police officer, then tried to dissolve his body in acid, has been jailed for life. Stefano Brizzi from South London was given a 24-year sentence. He said PC Gordon Semple had died in a sex game that had gone wrong. In Syria, state media is claiming that government forces have retaken the entire city of Aleppo, including those areas of the city once held by rebels. It's believed that opposition fighters and tens of thousands of civilians are now packed in an enclave which is smaller than 4 square miles. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, has just spent 10 days in Aleppo. She's now travelled to Beirut, and we can talk to Lise now. Lise, a thought on these claims that are being made. What is your assessment of things?
Not just claims anymore, Hugh. These are clearly the final hours of what has been a very long and brutal 4-year battle for Syria's second city. It's clear now that the Syrian army, backed critically by its Russian ally, as well as an array of militias backed by Iran, is closing in on victory. All the reports that we have are that the remainder of the rebels, and what are believed still to be thousands of civilians trapped in what's left of the rebel strongholds, it's just a matter of a few neighbourhoods, possibly even one neighbourhood that left. They're cornered now and absolutely terrified. We're getting dreadful messages coming from East Aleppo of people writing their last wills on social media. People are saying goodbye to their families, fearing the worst, believing they won't live to see the end of this night. But being this such a divisive war, what is a dark, dark moment on one side of Aleppo is a bright, bright moment on the other. For hours now, there's been guns fired in celebration across West Aleppo, which is mainly government supporting. They see it as a victory in the battle against terrorism. They char all of the rebel groups involved in East Aleppo and elsewhere, whether they're groups backed by the West or fighters linked to Al-Qaeda. They're all the same. They are terrorist groups. They have been fighters who have been firing rockets and mortars into Aleppo for the past 4 years. President Assad's forces are on the brink of their most significant victory of the 6-year war. For the rebels, their most significant defeat. But everyone knows, whether victor or vanquished knows, it's not the end of the war yet.
Lise, thanks very much. Lise Doucet, our chief international correspondent, with the latest there on the situation in Aleppo. And Lise is in Beirut for us tonight. The government says it will consider legislating to force the Football Association to change the way it's run. It follows calls from 5 former FA chairmen and chief executives for Parliament to intervene. They claim that the organisation is being held back by underqualified elderly white men. But the FA says it's already working on reforms to its governance. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has the story.
It runs the game from top to bottom, from the England team to the FA Cup and down to the grassroots. But today the FA came under unprecedented attack from 5 former executives who argue the organisation they used to run is simply incapable of reforming itself.
They've set up a structure and a system which means you can almost stay forever. It's overwhelmingly old white men. That's not the people who are playing football today.
The FA is not an organisation that is capable of self-reform. There is too much vested interest and just too much sort of fixed thinking. So in order to make some fundamental reform at the Football Association, it needs, I believe, outside intervention.
The former executives say the FA's council is unrepresentative and antiquated, and that there aren't enough independent directors on its board, where vested interests have gained a stranglehold.
Payet on the free kick. And in!
This, in turn, they argue, has allowed wealth and power to be concentrated with the Premier League, and they now want legislation to force the FA into governance reforms. This evening, the Premier League, along with Spurs and England star Dele Alli, marked the 10th anniversary of their social inclusion programme. The Sports Minister was here too and told me change had to happen.
If legislation is something that has to be considered as a consequence of the Football Association and other sports not reforming themselves, then that is something that we do. But I strongly believe that actually funding incentives is the right way forward. Let's be clear, if they don't reform themselves, they will lose public money.
This event tonight was meant to be about the Premier League celebrating the contribution that it's made to the grassroots of the sport. Instead, it's been forced to defend itself against accusations that its vast wealth has made it too powerful. Are you annoyed at the timing, or is it actually quite convenient?
The irony that people who should know better, make those sort of comments is completely crazy. The reality is, people know where our money goes. We're the most transparent. Most of our money goes unashamedly to putting on the show that is the Premier League. But part of that success, nobody puts more money into grassroots, into the lower reaches of football. We do more than any other country. We're going to give away over 100 million this year alone.
The FA said today it had already made reforms and that more would follow. It's not the first time there's been calls for it to change its ways, but these could just be the hardest to ignore. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Tottenham.
The former Conservative Cabinet Minister Lord Pryor has died at the age of 89. Jim Pryor served as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and Employment Secretary under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. He was one of the so-called wets in her first cabinet. He disagreed with many of her economic policies and sought a more conciliatory relationship with the trade union movement. Hundreds of thousands of rail users who use some of Britain's busiest lines have been advised not to travel tomorrow. Drivers for Southern Railways are due to start another 48-hour strike as part of a dispute about driver-only trains. Transport Secretary Chris Grayling said he'd written to the unions. He said he hadn't received a reply yet. Our transport correspondent Richard Westcott is in Brighton tonight. And Richard, just bring us up to date on what tomorrow holds.
Yes, the last stragglers just getting home actually before everything stops in a couple of hours' time. I've just spoken to a couple of drivers, 40 years experience between them. They've never been on strike before and they said they've never known anything like it. They said the relationship between the staff and the company has completely broken down. So I'll give you some details from the strike. It starts tomorrow, so it's Tuesday, Wednesday and Friday, but you can expect Thursday to be bad as well because the trains get out of position. That affects 300,000 passengers who would go every day, so that's nearly 1 million, I guess, passenger journeys across the 3 days. And why is that? Because Southern runs about 2,000 services every day. They are all stopping tomorrow. Every single one. Half of the Gatwick Express's services are also going to be stopping. So we're talking about major disruption. Why should you care if you don't catch a Southern train? Well, it's costing you money because Southern doesn't work like other rail franchises. Normally the private company takes the money from fares and keeps it. With Southern, it's the government that takes the money from fares, but it also means it's the government that loses money when there are strikes and when there's disruption. Tens of millions of pounds, and we're all paying.
Richard, thanks very much for the latest there on the strike action. Richard, there in Brighton. Now, Theresa May will head to Brussels later this week for a summit of EU leaders. The Brexit process is not on the official agenda, though it will be discussed over dinner on Thursday, a dinner which Theresa May has not been invited to attend. So who'll be fighting Britain's corner? Sweden is traditionally one of Britain's closest European allies, but Prime Minister Stefan Löfven has warned the UK that it has to manage its expectations. He's been speaking exclusively to our Europe editor Katja Adler.
Chill winds blow through Stockholm at this time of year. Yet Sweden's instinctive attitude towards Britain is far from icy. The countries are business-minded, Brussels-sceptic, non-Eurozone allies. But they'll soon be divided across the Brexit negotiating table, as the government here is all too aware.
I've spoken both to the previous Prime Minister Cameron, but also to Prime Minister May, and I've said that yes, Sweden wants to play a practical role, but that you cannot just pick and choose. There is no organization in the world where you can join and say, I want only these parts of that cooperation, but I do not want those parts.
Isn't it in Sweden's interest to have good trade relations with the UK? Sure. I mean, the UK is Sweden's fourth largest trading partner. If there are tariffs suddenly between the countries, you're going to lose out.
Of course, no, and that's what I would say. We are one of the UK's like-minded countries. We have cooperated within the European Union on many issues, and that is why we are eager, of course, to keep that good relationship. But if one country can get only the benefits as they see it, well, other countries would want that as well.
Even in your own government, between your trade minister and your finance minister, there have been differences of opinion whether we should be tough with the UK or soft with the UK. What chances are there for unity?
Starting with my own government, because I know that no, we are united. We need a result of these negotiations that make EU27 work in a good way.
Would you worry about calls for a Swexit here in Sweden if Britain gets too good a deal?
No, I'm not. The truth is actually that we, as a small country, very trade-dependent country, we understand that this kind of cooperation is very good for us. So there are populist forces right now in Sweden trying to do the same thing, but my reading is no, they do not have the support.
But anti-establishment sentiment is growing here. Newly confident Swedish neo-Nazis recently took to the streets in this, their biggest march since World War II. Inspired, they said, by the election victory of Donald Trump. And this is a campaign video for the anti-immigrant, anti-establishment Sweden Democrat Party, hugely popular since the migrant crisis.
Rösta på Sverigedemokraterna.
Yes, I am worried. I'm deeply worried. But I don't buy Sweden Democrats' reasons for this, because they've always blamed the immigrants. We have had too many years in Sweden with growing gaps in our society. And those gaps are dangerous. And that is why we are building a fair society where everybody can say, well, I have a chance as well, I have a future.
How confident do you feel that your government and that the wider EU can touch the public who are growing so disenchanted with figures of the establishment like yourself, like the EU?
EU has been too much of a market-driven organization and need to be that as well. But now we need to put the social dimension very clear on the EU agenda, showing the people that this is not only about market, it's about you.
At their summit this Thursday, EU leaders will try to reassure one another that they can stand strong against populism and the post-Brexit blues. It's going to be quite a challenge. Katja Adler, BBC News, Stockholm.
Walter Swinburne, one of the best-known jockeys of his generation, has died at the age of 55.
Wally Swinburne looks round. He's on his own. Shergar!
Nicknamed the Choir Boy, Swinburne was just 19 years old when he won his most famous race, riding the great Shergar to a 10-length victory in the 1981 Derby at Epsom. He went on to win 8 English Classics in all, became a successful trainer following his retirement in the year 2000. The former BBC weather presenter Ian McCaskill, who for years was one of the most recognisable faces on British television, has died at the age of 78. He'd been suffering from dementia. Our correspondent David Sillito looks back at his life.
Hello. frost is going to be widespread over the weekend. We have already had the worst of the refreshing rain, that was during the night. It's cloudy over most of England and Wales at the moment, and there are outbreaks of rain.
Ian McCaskill. It all began in 1978. The weather had never sounded like this before.
And temperatures in the south of Britain much closer to the normal for this time of year. Good evening, Joe.
Over the next 20 years, he became Britain's best-known weatherman.
The weather is going to be wrong. It's going to be particularly wrong here in the south.
A gift to impersonators, Rory Bremner said this evening he was virtually a member of the cast. But this RAF-trained meteorologist had never set out to be a TV star.
Big break into forecasting on the television was this notice that came round the Met Office saying, do you fancy an all expenses paid weekend in London? To my horror and to my wife's horror, shock and dismay, I got the job.
And viewers took to this enthusiastic Glaswegian and his daily struggle with the weather board.
Another basically...
Yes, that is a touch of Gough off Cornwall. He became something of a celebrity, but he also had to face the music when the Met Office didn't predict the hurricane winds of 1987.
Well, Ian, you chaps were a fat lot of good last night.
I admit, we weren't forecasting hurricane force winds.
There were two Ian McCaskills. He was a highly professional meteorologist, one of the old school. Put him in front of a camera and there was a completely different Ian McCaskill. He became a comedian, a cuddly, lovable comedian.
Ian McCaskill, the TV forecaster who could make even the most depressing British weather a pleasure to watch.
Tributes to Ian McCaskill today, who's died at the age of 78. Quick reminder that Newsnight's coming up. Here's Emily.
Tonight we look at the rise of the so-called alt-right across Europe, patriot groups that call themselves identitarians. Are they merely on the fringe or do they have the potential to transform Europe? Join me now on BBC 2, 11 p.m. in Scotland.
That's Newsnight with Emily. Here on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.